If you observe carefully what the world's most powerful financial institutions are doing with their reserves, you'll notice something extraordinary happening. In 2023, central banks purchased 1,037 tons of gold, the second highest annual total on record. The People's Bank of China added over 300 tons in 2 years. Poland increased gold reserves by 100%. Turkey's central bank now holds 27% of reserves in gold, up from 15% 5 years ago. These aren't amateur investors chasing trends. These are institutions that print currencies, manage trillions in assets, and have information retail investors will never see. When central banks worldwide engage in coordinated buying of a single asset at levels not seen in decades, they're telling you something critical about the future of money itself. This isn't a prediction. It's a logical consequence of what happens when the world's reserve currency system becomes unstable. I've spent over 40 years studying monetary systems, currency transitions, and patterns that emerge when trust in fiat money erodes. When you understand incentives, you understand behavior. Right now, central bank incentives are clear. They need an asset that cannot be devalued by another country's monetary policy, cannot be frozen as a political weapon, and maintains value across centuries. Gold is the second largest currency in the world by central bank holdings, surpassed only by the US dollar, and the gap is closing. Central banks hold approximately 35,000 tons of gold, worth roughly $2.5 trillion. This represents about 15% of all central bank reserves globally, the highest percentage since 1990. These numbers are moving in one direction: more gold, fewer dollars. To understand why gold functions as a currency, you need to understand what money actually is. Money serves three functions: medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value. For thousands of years, gold excelled at all three. Governments convinced populations that paper currencies were better because they were more convenient. Think of currency like a restaurant gift card. When you trust the restaurant, it works perfectly. But when you notice the restaurant printing unlimited cards, diluting yours, or refusing to honor cards from people they disagree with, that paper loses appeal. You want something the restaurant can't manipulate. Gold is that something. Three fundamental pressures are forcing central banks to reconsider reserves. First, weaponization of the dollar through sanctions created fear that reserves could be frozen overnight. When the US and Europe froze $300 billion of Russian reserves in 2022, every central bank governor took notice. Gold in your own vaults cannot be frozen. Second, US federal debt exceeding $36 trillion and growing by $2 trillion annually creates questions about dollar stability. No reserve currency has survived while the issuing country runs persistent structural deficits of this magnitude. Third, alternative payment systems. China's CIPS, Russia's SPFS, India's UPI mean countries have options they lacked a decade ago. History is an excellent teacher, and gold serving as monetary insurance has repeated across every major currency transition. When the British pound lost reserve status after World War I, countries with significant gold reserves weathered the transition far better. The pound lost 60% of purchasing power between 1920 and 1940. Gold holders maintained wealth. France under Charles de Gaulle recognized this pattern in the 1960s. He famously demanded the US exchange dollars for gold, understanding that paper promises were becoming unreliable. France accumulated 3,000 tons of gold, providing a foundation that helped weather multiple currency devaluations through the 1970s and 1980s. The 1971 Nixon shock provides the most relevant parallel. Before August 1971, the dollar was backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Foreign central banks could exchange dollars for physical gold at this fixed rate. But the US had printed far more dollars than it had gold to redeem. Countries like France and Germany began demanding gold, draining US reserves from over 20,000 tons to under 9,000 tons. Nixon's solution was closing the gold window, effectively defaulting on the dollar's gold backing. Over the next decade, the dollar lost over 50% of purchasing power against goods and services, but gold rose from $35 to $850 per ounce, a 2,300% increase. Central banks holding gold saw reserves appreciate 20-fold in nominal terms and multiply many times in real purchasing power. Those holding primarily dollars suffered devastating losses even though they received all promised interest payments. The Plaza Accord of 1985 demonstrates how reserve concentration creates risk. When major economies agreed to devalue the dollar against the yen and Deutschmark, countries with diverse reserves, including gold, protected wealth far better than those concentrated in dollars. Japan, holding minimal gold, watched dollar reserves lose 50% of value within 2 years. The lesson became clear to every serious central bank. No matter how dominant a reserve currency appears, concentration creates unacceptable risk. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated gold's modern role as monetary insurance. When the Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, and Bank of England engaged in unprecedented quantitative easing, creating trillions in new currency to prevent financial system collapse, gold rose from $800 in 2008 to $1,900 by 2011. Central banks that increased gold holdings during this period protected purchasing power, while those holding only government bonds saw real value erosion despite receiving nominal returns. The post-crisis decade from 2008 to 2020 taught sophisticated institutions that monetary expansion was the new normal, and gold protection was essential rather than optional. To understand gold's role as the second largest currency, you need 3 fundamental principles. The first principle is that all currencies are relative. The dollar has value relative to what it purchases. When dollar supply increases faster than goods and services, each dollar loses purchasing power. Gold has relatively fixed supply. Annual mining adds roughly 1.5% to total above-ground supply, stable for decades. You cannot print gold. The second principle is that monetary trust is fragile. The dollar's reserve status was built over decades through economic dominance, military power, and fiscal discipline. But each pillar is being tested. Annual $2 trillion deficits erode fiscal credibility. Political polarization raises stability questions. Trust that took 70 years to build can unravel in a decade if countries believe the U.S. will prioritize domestic politics over maintaining the dollar's purchasing power for foreign holders. The third principle is that central banks think in generational time horizons, planning for 50 or 100 years ahead. In that frame, what asset has maintained value? Gold has been recognized as valuable for 5,000 years, across every civilization, through countless currency collapses and wars. The dollar has existed 250 years and lost 98% of purchasing power. The euro is barely 25 years old. What do you hold when protecting national wealth across unknown futures? You hold the asset that has worked for 5,000 years. Let me tell you a story about 2 central banks facing identical circumstances in 1999 as the euro was being introduced and major currency realignments were beginning. Bank A held 70% US dollars, 20% euros and European currencies, 5% yen, and 5% gold. This reflected conventional wisdom. Gold was a barbarous relic, dollars were the undisputed global reserve, and modern fiat currencies managed by sophisticated central banks represented the future. Bank B had a more conservative governor who had lived through the currency crises of the 1970s and remembered what happened when monetary trust eroded. They held 40% dollars, 30% euros, 10% yen, 15% gold, and 5% in diversified other currencies. Over 25 years from 1999 to 2024, both banks managed their country's reserves and adjusted as circumstances changed. Bank A followed mainstream institutional thinking. They actually reduced gold holdings to just 3% by 2010, actively selling gold as its price rose from $300 to $800 per ounce. The proceeds were reinvested into dollar-denominated government bonds, which seemed to provide both safety and yield in an era of low interest rates. Bank A's governors felt sophisticated and modern, having shed the weight of ancient metal for the convenience and income of paper assets. By 2024, with gold trading at $2,650 per ounce, and after multiple rounds of quantitative easing had systematically diluted the dollar's purchasing power, Bank A's reserves had grown nominally by about 85%. On paper, they had nearly doubled over a quarter century. But when measured in real purchasing power, what those reserves could actually buy in terms of commodities, energy, real estate, or productive assets on international markets, the increase was only about 15%. Inflation, hidden in official statistics but real in actual transactions, had eroded most of the nominal gains. The bank had more dollars but less actual wealth. Bank B took a different path. They maintained their higher gold allocation throughout the period and actually increased it to 20% during the 2008 financial crisis, buying when others were selling in panic. Their reserves grew nominally by 145% over the same 25-year period. More significantly, their real purchasing power increased by approximately 65%. The gold holdings, which had appreciated from roughly $300 per ounce to $2,650, provided both stability during multiple crises and appreciation that outpaced currency debasement. When Bank B's country needed to make large international purchases, whether securing long-term energy contracts, acquiring strategic technology, or building infrastructure, they could operate from a position of strength. Bank A's country found itself increasingly squeezed, needing to accumulate ever more reserves just to maintain purchasing power parity with previous years. This isn't theoretical or made up. It's the typical pattern we observe when comparing central banks that maintained or increased gold reserves versus those following the conventional wisdom of minimizing gold holdings. Switzerland, maintaining approximately 20% of reserves in gold, has preserved stronger reserve purchasing power than comparable countries that held minimal gold. The European Central Bank's quiet requirement that member states hold at least 15% of reserves in gold has provided a stability foundation that pure fiat reserve systems lack, even when individual governors don't publicly emphasize this requirement. Now let's translate this to what really matters, how this affects you and why you should care about central bank gold buying, even if you're not managing a national reserve. If you're 58 with $750,000 in retirement savings, central bank behavior provides the most reliable signal available about monetary trends. These institutions have information access, analytical resources, and time horizons that individual investors lack. When they move in coordinated fashion toward a single asset class, they're seeing something that hasn't yet appeared in mainstream financial news. Right now, they're seeing dollar vulnerability and systemic monetary instability, and they're moving aggressively to protect against it. Here's what a plausible scenario looks like over the next 7 to 10 years based on current trends. The U.S. government continues running massive structural deficits, approaching $2 trillion annually, as neither political party shows any willingness to make the painful spending cuts or tax increases necessary for fiscal balance. This deficit spending requires constant bond issuance. Eventually, the Federal Reserve will need to return to aggressive money printing to finance this debt because foreign central banks are reducing purchases and domestic private demand cannot absorb the supply. Other countries will accelerate de-dollarization efforts, reducing dollar holdings from perhaps 60% of global reserves toward 45% or lower. This might seem gradual, but it represents several $trillion in selling pressure concentrated over a relatively short period. As dollar demand decreases relative to supply, the Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice. They can either allow interest rates to rise dramatically to attract bond buyers, which would bankrupt the federal government through unsustainable interest expenses on $36 trillion in debt, or they can increase money printing to purchase the bonds themselves, which means direct currency debasement. They will choose money printing because the alternative is immediate government insolvency. This means dollar devaluation is not just probable, but mathematically inevitable given current trajectories. If you hold $750,000 in assets primarily in dollar-denominated stocks and bonds, you're fully exposed to this devaluation with no hedge. Your account balance might grow to $850,000 over 7 years through normal market returns and bond interest. The numbers on your statement will increase, making you feel like you're accumulating wealth. But if the dollar loses 30% of its purchasing power during this same period through the combination of official inflation and hidden currency debasement, your real wealth has actually declined to approximately $595,000 in today's purchasing power terms. The goods and services you can actually buy have decreased even though the nominal account value increased. This is the insidious nature of currency debasement. You feel richer while actually becoming poorer. Meanwhile, consider someone in identical circumstances who allocated 25% to gold, watching it rise from $2,000 to potentially $4,500 per ounce as central banks continue systematic buying and currency concerns intensify globally. That person maintains real purchasing power while dollar-heavy portfolios erode. They're not speculating or gambling. They're doing exactly what the world's most sophisticated reserve managers are doing, holding the asset that cannot be printed or devalued by any single government's monetary policy. Let me make this even more concrete with daily life impacts that you'll actually experience. Assume you retire in 3 years and have carefully planned to spend $80,000 annually to cover all your expenses: housing, healthcare, food, utilities, transportation, and modest entertainment and travel. You've calculated that $750,000 will provide this income through a combination of investment returns and gradual principal drawdown over your expected 25-year retirement. The math works perfectly based on historical returns and moderate inflation assumptions. But if currency debasement runs 7 to 8% annually in your actual living expenses, while your bonds yield only 4 to 5%, and stocks provide 7 to 8% nominal returns, your purchasing power declines 3% each year on average. In just 10 years into retirement, your originally planned $80,000 annual budget needs to be $107,000 to buy the exact same goods and services you're purchasing today. Your carefully planned retirement income falls short by $27,000 annually. You're forced to either significantly reduce your standard of living, cutting out the travel you'd planned, reducing healthcare quality, or moving to a smaller home. Or you deplete principal faster than originally planned, dramatically increasing the risk of running out of money in your 80s when you're most vulnerable and least able to return to work. Now consider the same scenario with 25% of your portfolio allocated to gold. If gold appreciates to even $3,500 per ounce over 10 years, conservative compared to its move from $300 to $2,650 over the previous 20 years, your $187,500 gold allocation becomes approximately $327,000. This gain of $139,500 doesn't just offset the purchasing power loss from your other assets. It provides a substantial buffer that maintains your retirement security exactly as originally planned. You can afford the travel you envisioned. You can access quality health care without financial stress. You can help your children or grandchildren if needed. The gold did exactly what central banks needed to do. It protected against currency debasement using the same mechanism they rely on. Based on these principles, here are practical guidelines aligning your strategy with sophisticated institutions. First, think like a central bank. Hold cash for 6 months' expenses, bonds for medium-term needs over 5 years, and strategic assets like gold for long-term purchasing power protection. Second, establish a meaningful gold position. For someone in or approaching retirement, 20 to 30% in precious metals aligns with conservative central banks. A reasonable allocation. 25% total, with 20% in physical gold you control directly and 5% in gold ETFs for liquidity. Third, accumulate steadily over time. Central banks buy in all market conditions: $1,800, $2,200, $2,650. They're not trading, they're accumulating strategic reserves. Implement your allocation over 12 months through monthly purchases, averaging your entry price and removing timing pressure. Fourth, understand different gold investments. Physical gold you hold directly provides monetary insurance like central banks get. Mining stocks offer leveraged exposure but carry operational risks. Gold ETFs provide liquidity but introduce counterparty risk. Use all three strategically: majority in physical for insurance, smaller ETF positions for liquidity, potentially mining stocks for growth if you can tolerate volatility. Fifth, prepare for volatility without losing purpose. Gold dropped from $1,900 to $1,050 between 2011 and 2015. Central banks didn't panic. They understood they held strategic reserves for long-term insurance, not trading profits. Some bought more at lower prices. By 2020, gold hit $2,000. By 2024, $2,650. Banks that held through volatility protected reserves. Those that sold locked in losses and missed recovery. Sixth, don't compare gold to stock returns during bull markets. Gold outperforms during monetary chaos and currency debasement, exactly when you need protection most. From 2008 to 2011, while stocks struggled recovering from crisis, gold surged 140%. From 2019 to 2024, during extraordinary monetary expansion, gold gained 72%. These are the periods when gold does what it's designed to do. Seventh, Recognize that waiting for cheaper prices might mean missing protection entirely. Central banks aren't waiting for $2,000 gold. They're buying at $2,650 because they understand that relative to paper currency liabilities facing 30 to 50% purchasing power loss, gold at any current price is rational insurance, not speculation. Nothing in this constitutes specific financial advice. Each person has different circumstances, time horizons, and obligations. Consult qualified professionals who understand monetary history and central bank behavior. The choice is yours. But remember what's happening while Americans debate bond yields. The Swiss National Bank allocated 7% of reserves to gold, up from nearly zero a decade ago. Central banks globally added over 1,000 tons in 2023, the highest in decades. Norway's sovereign wealth fund systematically reduced bonds while increasing real assets. Singapore's GIC and Temasek shifted billions from bonds into infrastructure and tangible assets. The Bank of Japan abandoned yield curve control when mathematics became impossible. These are the most sophisticated institutions managing trillions, voting with their capital. That's why this channel exists. To observe signals before they become obvious. To understand incentives before they manifest in unrecoverable losses. We observe what major institutions do, not what they say. We study history to recognize repeating patterns. We explain mechanisms so ordinary Americans can make informed decisions. If this helps you understand why gold functions as the world's second largest currency, if it clarifies why central banks are buying at levels signaling deep concern, then subscribe. More importantly, consider whether your reserves should include the same strategic asset central banks worldwide are accumulating. The institutions that print money are buying the one thing they cannot print. The wealth you've accumulated represents decades of work and discipline. Protecting it requires recognizing when the monetary environment changes. When doing what central banks do makes more sense than following retail advice designed for a stable era that no longer exists. We're living through a transition. Those who position accordingly will preserve purchasing power. Those who ignore institutional behavior will learn that nominal safety and real safety aren't the same. The choice is yours.